Okay, thanks very much, John, for that introduction. I just wanted to start out the webinar today with this image taken in Point Gatineau roughly 15 months ago. Point Gatineau is one of the case studies that we looked at for this report, and I'll be talking about that in a few minutes. But I always like starting with reference to a real-world event rather than something abstract. So as John mentioned, the report, the presentation today is entitled Supporting Long-Term Climate Resiliency in Canada Through Planned Retreat. And of course, we're starting with the disclaimer that the views that are expressed in the webinar are those of the Jevity Project team and do not necessarily reflect those of Natural Resources Canada or of the Government of Canada. So just to start with, I wanted to highlight the importance of terminology, and we confronted this early in the project as we were trying to define for ourselves and for the reading audience of the report, what do we mean by planned retreat? There are multiple different terms that are used in the literature and used in practice. Managed retreat, as John mentioned, is probably the most common, but faces some opposition. There's facilitated retreat, there's planned resettlement, assisted resettlement, and on it goes. So we learned very early on, and this is maybe one of the key takeaways from this report and this webinar, it's important to get your terminology right when working with communities and when beginning to present the idea of retreat. So this comes back to our definition: planned retreat as the purposeful movement of people, infrastructure, or land uses from areas at high risk of flooding, slope destabilization, storm surge, sea level rise, and other risks made worse by climate change to areas that are at lower risk or more resilient. So as John mentioned, this definition is skewed towards climate change adaptation rather than necessarily post-disaster retreat. Over on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see a circular portion of the diagram that we've called the 5 stages of adaptation, or 5 stages of climate change adaptation, where we really see this as a cyclical process over time. Communities are faced with challenges or projected challenges of climate change, which might lead to different hazards in their community or more accentuated hazards. And so there's a need to engage in some sort of adaptation cycle. So typically the first stage in the bottom right-hand side is trying to understand climate impacts through projections, through data gathering, in some cases through communications with community members who might have a long-term memory of climate in that area, but really trying to understand the projected impacts of climate. And then assessing vulnerabilities and risk, the second stage, in the community and more widely, some of the vulnerabilities that might exist through a changing climate. The third stage typically is identifying and selecting adaptation options. This is really the meat of climate change adaptation. What are all the options, and which out of all of those options do we think is going to mesh with our community as it is now? You'll see off on the left-hand side that third stage breaks out into a few other options, which I'll talk about in a second. But I'll go on to the fourth stage, which is basically implementing actions. After this, there has been decision-making about which of the broad range of adaptation options should we actually go forward with. And then after you implement your climate change adaptation actions or your options, then really you should monitor and see how effectively those adaptation options are dealing with the changing climate and the hazards posed by a changing climate. And if they're not completely dealing with that or not satisfactorily dealing with climate change hazards, then there's an opportunity to adjust going forward. So if we find that climate change adaptation is not necessarily dealing with the hazards the way that we thought they were going to play out, then maybe we engage in a second cycle or a third cycle even of climate change adaptation. So coming back to stage 3, the IPCC back in the 1990s came up with what's now a fairly well-recognized approach for dealing with especially coastal flooding, coastal inundation, and sometimes river flooding. And that's, we're calling this the Para Adaptation Options Framework. So the acronym is simply protect, accommodate, retreat, or avoid. So protect, building usually engineered structures to protect communities against climate change hazards. Accommodation or accommodate is where you might take the community as it is currently, being threatened by hazards, and do something to allow that community to continue to occupy hazardous areas, maybe by raising buildings or flood-proofing, or putting in other building level accommodations that allow those structures to still function going forward. Of course, we're focusing on retreat, the third option, and that's moving people, houses, homeowners, and sometimes infrastructure to lower risk areas. The fourth option, avoid, is usually used in areas where there may not be currently development, but there are plans for the future. So an expanding city, or a new city, or a new community. So as much as possible, you'd like to identify the hazards ahead of time and then avoid putting development right in the midst of those hazards. So this is our basic framework for the work that we've done and for the report. And we'll get into more of the details of that, especially through the case studies. So what I'll move on to here is the basic overview for the rest of our time. We'll talk briefly about the approach we use, the current state of retreat in Canada. I will talk about 3 of the 6 case studies that are in this report: Surrey, BC, Lake Erie, Ontario, and Gatineau, Quebec. And then spend the remainder of the webinar talking about the good practices that we've been able to distill partly from the literature and partly from the people that we spoke to about planned retreat. And those good practices are really broken out into 3 categories: communication, governance, and the process of planned retreat. And if I do my job correctly, we'll have time for discussion afterwards. So basically the approach that we used, the consulting team, Jevity consulting team, adopted a desk study approach whereby a lot of the material that we depended on was written literature, academic literature, government reports, research institute reports. We looked very broadly across that literature and came across over 300 pieces that seemed to have something to say about climate change adaptation and the connection to planned retreat. We then winnowed that down to 125 pieces of literature that were really much more specific to planned retreat, 55 of which had much more application in Canada. And then we ended up with only about 30 pieces of literature that really directly looked at planned retreat in Canada. That was informed through a series of key informant interviews, 10 interviews with government practitioners on the ground, academic experts on planned retreat. And really, collectively, those key informants had a really strong background in planned retreat and the various challenges associated with that. We also had a very important advisory committee of more than 25 individuals, Canadian landscape architects, government planners, government staff, researchers, and academics who also had significant expertise in planned retreat. So they functioned as a source of ideas for the report as we developed it, and to check some of our ideas as we released those to the advisory committee. The primary focus of our report, and what you'll see in this webinar, is municipal leaders, municipal practitioners who are basically confronting how to do planned retreat. And in some cases, these are higher levels of government that might be supporting planned retreat at a municipal or a county level. So our study revealed that currently planned retreat in Canada is primarily reactive, although that's changing. Reactive to disasters that are happening, flooding or coastal inundation, coastal storm surge. And we found what we might call non-standardized approaches. There's a wide range of approaches that are practiced across Canada. And for example, different provincial governments seem to practice planned retreat differently. They have different outlooks, they have different funding programs. In some cases, provincial governments don't have funding programs. And so there's a sense, I think, in Canada that there's a lot of value to try and standardize somewhat the approach that's used from province to province, territory to territory, and even from city to city. When we're thinking about planned retreat for climate change, typically that involves very long time frames, multiple decades, maybe ranging up to 80 to 100 years of expected climate change, and the time that we have to think about climate change adaptation options like retreat. As I mentioned at the outset, the terminology challenges are significant, and that's probably a really good starting point for municipalities thinking about talking to community members about this idea of retreat. Invest in some time to talk about the terminology and see what resonates with the community. What we're finding, though, is that the terminology is not standardized across Canada. We, as much as possible, tried to identify good practices from the literature and from our key informants. And there was really no one place that we could go to where we could say, oh, somebody else has done this. Let's just document the good practices that are available through other research. So I think that's partially another contribution of this report. We have found in the last 5 to 10 years especially that there seems to be increased citizen awareness and support in Canadian communities, but in other countries as well. And I think some of this has to do with some fairly high-profile disasters that have revealed the limitations of other climate change adaptation options. So Superstorm Sandy in 2013 was a good example, or 2012, where that really gained a lot of traction in the literature and in the media. Or the flooding that happened in Alberta in 2013. Again, I think that seemed to drive greater acceptance of the idea of retreat from hazard. We also found that planned retreat projects and implementation is often quite inequitable. People are left out of the process. In some cases, in reference to mandatory retreat, some people are included in that mandatory retreat action, and literally their neighbors are not included. And so this can be perceived, especially by communities, as being quite inequitable. I think the drive or the increase of citizen awareness and support and government support for retreat is often driven by understanding of economics. Just how much will it cost to adapt to the climate change that we know is coming? And the options that we choose all have a dollar figure attached to them. So in some cases, and one of the case studies I'll talk about clearly reflects this, the planned retreat option can often be a low cost or even the lowest cost option for dealing with future hazards. The literature also revealed very frequently that once a disaster like a flood has passed, residents perceive planned retreat bureaucracy often as being the second disaster that they had to confront in a short period of time. Just navigating the bureaucracy, often on your own, having applications rejected for bureaucratic reasons, or having changes of programs midstream that really force people to start again. So that's something that is very commonly mentioned in the literature. And then finally, health challenges. I think most people can understand that if you are being offered or you're being forced to move from your home and your neighborhood, that might trigger some significant psychological, psychosocial, and sometimes physical health problems. And that was documented in the literature. So I'm going to go into 3 of the case studies. The 6 case studies that will be included in the report when it's published. On the West Coast, Surrey, British Columbia, High River, Alberta. In Central Canada, Great Lakes, Lake Erie, and Gatineau, Quebec. In the Maritimes, Truro, Nova Scotia. And then in the Arctic, Tuktoyaktuk is the sixth of those case studies. So I'll be talking about 3 today, just for time. Starting on the West Coast, Surrey, British Columbia, if you're familiar with that municipality, part of the Greater Vancouver region, and the largest municipality in the Greater Vancouver region. But about 20% of the city is either in river or coastal floodplain. So there's significant risks currently in Surrey, and even more significantly under projected climate change. There's an understanding that Surrey will have to confront climate change and adapt through a variety of options. So Surrey currently has recurrent coastal flooding, and projections are suggesting that this will only increase in the future, enhanced by sea level rise and perhaps even winter storm activity. So Surrey engaged back in 2016 in a process of climate change adaptation that they call their Coastal Flooding Adaptation Strategy, or CFAS. And this was about a 3.5-year process involving that cycle of climate change adaptation that we mentioned earlier. And that played out until about 2019, and they're now at the implementation cycle. So the stage 4 of the climate change adaptation cycle, they're now implementing, and eventually they'll be monitoring and adjusting their plans once those results are on the ground and operating. One of the things that we looked at for case studies is the degree of choice that residents have in this question about whether to retreat or not. And in some cases, you know, in the literature, we find that some communities or community members essentially have no choice. They're told to move. But in the case of Surrey, what we found is that residents had a very high degree of choice in that process. There was broad consultation across the city. There were multiple opportunities to feed information into the CFAS cycle of adaptation. And essentially, the feeling was that anybody who cared to comment on climate change adaptation had one or more possibilities of contributing. So that led to our assessment that this really had a high degree of choice. Ultimately, for this cycle of adaptation, Surrey residents have rejected the idea of planned retreat, but that's only this cycle. And there may be multiple future cycles as climate change continues to play out and the hazards facing Surrey residents change. This was an attempt to be proactive. Climate change in the next 80 to 100 years, and the community is starting to see some of those impacts, but they're really trying to get ahead of the worst of those impacts by considering retreat. The CFAS process looked at neighborhoods, especially 3 particular neighborhoods that were at particular risk, involving many hundreds of households, in some cases entire neighborhoods, and to some degree the possibility of realigning infrastructure threatened by coastal inundation or coastal erosion. Surrey, if you look at the census data, is primarily English-speaking, but Surrey as a geographic whole, and for this CFAS study, also included the Semiahmoo First Nation. So it was at least a more complex community than might have appeared. The graphic at the bottom right-hand side is just showing you the 5 phases. You know, we prefer to show it as a cycle, but they've shown it kind of linearly. So that was their first case study. It was a revealing case study of proactive and anticipatory climate change adaptation involving the idea of retreat. The second case study is actually a series of case studies in one geographic area, the North Shore of Lake Erie. And basically, we looked at an area from Rondo Provincial Park to Point Pelee National Park, about 70 kilometers, where there are multiple sites of recurrent flooding, recurrent erosion, affecting, in some cases, homeowners or houses, in other cases, farmland and linear infrastructure like roads and highways. And this has all been driven by the high water levels in the Great Lakes, especially in this case, Lake Erie, since 2013. A lot of information, if you're interested in delving into this more deeply, Peter Zuzik and Linda Morch released a report in late April, and a lot of the information that we've looked at was sourced from that report. So because these are multiple sites, it was really hard to say the degree of choice for the idea of planned retreat in this case study. In some cases, the degree of choice is fairly low. Homeowners are literally a meter away from the high water marks during storms, or maybe even having some of their front yard eroding. So their actual choice in the matter is fairly low. In other cases, especially infrastructure realignment, the owners of those assets have a lot of degree of choice when to retreat, whether to retreat, or maybe choose protection rather than retreat. And so there's a broad range of different degrees of choice within these multiple case studies. In some cases, the planned retreat in this 70-kilometer rectangle, in some of these cases, it's very reactive. As I've mentioned, front yards are falling into Lake Erie, and the writing is clearly on the wall, and discussions seem to kick up after every winter storm. But in other cases, and I think I'd come back to the managed realignment of infrastructure, this is very proactive. This is anticipatory of what might happen 30 to 40 years or even further down the road. The assets involved, over 400 individual buildings, in some cases entire neighborhoods, stretches of roads, and possibly farmland being affected by planned retreat. And the communities that we looked at, predominantly English, but including one First Nation. The third case study that we looked at was, actually there's a very important point that I wanted to bring out here. Sorry for going back. The options for adaptation for Lake Erie included the idea of protecting the shoreline, the entire, or very close to the entire 70-kilometer shoreline. And the cost of protecting that 70-kilometer stretch was anticipated between $600 and $900 million. When equivalent studies were conducted looking at how much would it cost to retreat homes or buildings or roads from those areas, the figure that we've been reading is between $60 and $90 million. So roughly 10% of the cost of protecting that entire shoreline. And this, I think, brings out the idea that sometimes economically, planned retreat can be a low cost or even the lowest cost climate change adaptation option. So sorry to have to go back, but that was a very important point that I skipped over. Okay, the city of Gatineau, and more specifically the neighborhood of Point Gatineau within Gatineau City. It's a water-dominated system with the Ottawa River directly in front of Point Gatineau and the city of Gatineau. Other rivers intersecting just upstream from that community. And this has really triggered recurrent riverine flooding over the past 200 years, ever since Point Gatineau was a community. But this has really reached, I think, a head as of 2017 and again in 2019 when major floods impacted the Gatineau region. Starting in 2017, the Quebec government began to offer buyouts to flood-affected homeowners. And this was revisited and changed slightly. The program was changed slightly in 2019. But essentially, the Quebec government is offering the opportunity to relocate, essentially sign over title of your house, with a maximum compensation value of $200,000 per house and an additional $50,000 for the land. Homeowners can then take that compensation, and on the open market, they can relocate, ideally to someplace that's much safer from local flooding. The other portion of the planned retreat program by the Quebec government, in Point Gatineau especially, some of the homes are located in the 1 to 20 year floodplain. So in those cases specifically, planned retreat is not voluntary. Homeowners are not allowed to rebuild after flooding. So this leads into the question of degrees of choice. In some cases, if you are in the 1 to 20 year floodplain, you have no choice. You must leave. If you're outside the 1 to 20 year floodplain and you've suffered some damage, you can then decide, can I rebuild using disaster assistance, or should I take planned retreat buyout money? So that's what's shown here on the screen. These were cases of very reactive planned retreat. It's reactive to flooding, even though flooding has affected these communities for hundreds of years. And in the latest 2 rounds of floods, at least 1,800 homes were affected and entire neighborhoods affected by flooding, predominantly French-speaking community. The only other thing I'll comment about the Gatineau case study is that about 185 homes have now accepted the buyouts and have been demolished, leaving empty lots that look exactly like what's on your screen. There's now the starts of a community plan to take all of these individual relocation choices and turn that into a more community-driven plan. What are we going to do about the land that's left behind that's currently empty lots? And can we use these retreat lands for community benefit? Green space, space that's simply available for future floods to spread out, walking trails, commemorative plaques, commenting on the people who used to live in this community who have now retreated for the better community benefit. Okay, this gets me to the final third of the presentation, the good practices that we've distilled from the case studies, from the literature that we consulted, and the key informants that we spoke to. So firstly, good practices surrounding communication. And I'll point out here that we've tried to identify within the climate change adaptation cycle where these good practices might fit in, but these are just examples. So this is not so much a cookbook approach. You must use this good practice in this part of the cycle. So we're just giving examples. So starting on the top left-hand side, choosing terminology carefully. I've mentioned that already. Certainly as you're beginning to have discussions with communities about climate change adaptation, ask the community what terminology they're comfortable with. And really don't try and force terminology that creates more problems than you really want. As part of the para-adaptation options framework, you can discuss with communities what options they see, and then perhaps they're not even considering the retreat option. But probably at the starting phases anyway, presenting more options is probably better, and then communities can wrap their heads around different options like protect versus retreat, or adding in 2 or 3 of those options as part of a coherent climate change adaptation plan. Leave time for planned retreat discussions on the bottom left. Some of these discussions may take decades or generations before they lead to a decision for retreat. It might not currently be acceptable to the members of a community, but the longer they live in that community and the more they see climate change playing out, there could be some change over time. Or there could be changes in who lives in those communities. Over on the right-hand side, communication, engagement, and consultation is absolutely critical. And it's really the only area of complete agreement that we found in the literature about climate change adaptation, and more specifically about retreat. I don't think we ever found one literature source that says do not communicate, do not engage. So it's a critical part of adaptation. Putting planned retreat in the context of adaptation. Maybe not pitching the idea of retreat as something that is reactive to the last disaster, but something that is more proactive for what we expect to come in the next 20, 30, 40, or 100 years. Considering culture, there are cultural differences between communities, and so even though we've come up with a series of good practices, certainly you have to reflect the culture in those communities as you decide how you're going to have conversations about adaptation, and more specifically about the idea of retreat. So First Nations culture, the kinds of conversations you'll have with a First Nations culture may be radically different from a highly urbanized waterfront Lake Ontario community just outside of Toronto. Computer graphics are persuasive. I think the idea that the unknown is fearful can be alleviated somewhat through computer graphics. So what will the retreated communities look like after homes have been removed? and after recreation amenities have been installed in those communities. Computer graphics can be very useful there. Moving on to governance, picking, and again starting on the left-hand side, picking leaders or a champion very carefully. Somebody that you know that can speak to the nuances of planned retreat or the wider nuances of climate change adaptation. And often it's not a single leader, it's a series of individuals that are working together for community good. There are significant concerns about the loss of a tax base if planned retreat is implemented. So often in communities where buyouts are offered to homeowners, they are not given any support about where to take that buyout money and where to purchase new homes. So there's concerns that that municipality might lose tax money. On the right-hand side, so coming back to the tax base, I think the good practice here is really to offer support to people who are considering planned retreat or accepting buyout offers. Support them to help remain in that community to maintain the tax base. On the right-hand side, expect to take a long time to assemble funding. We can't, currently in Canada, there is no single standalone program that is titled Funding for Planned Retreat. So often there is cost sharing, and it takes a significant amount of time to begin to fund planned retreat projects. This good practice of communities decide is encapsulated in the center of that circle, communication engagement. Generally, decisions to retreat are much better accepted by communities if the communities feel that they decided on that retreat decision. At the bottom right, establish and fund a program, ideally at the highest levels of government. The good practices suggest that this should be an ongoing program that can fund planned retreat if and when it's needed. Good practices regarding the process of planned retreat and planning for planned retreat. Part one, plan a future for the retreated properties. And this is often for psychological health for the communities or the individuals who are retreating. If those individuals understand what that retreat area will be used for and how it benefits communities, then it's often more acceptable to those individuals or those neighborhoods. Tap into universities and granting agencies to help. Personally speaking, if somebody approaches me and says, would you like to be engaged in a planned retreat planning process, I would jump all over myself to get involved. And there's many other granting agencies that will help take some of that funding hit away. Over on the right-hand side, protecting and promoting physical and mental health. That's critical as planned retreat plays out. Supporting individuals, homeowners, communities in their physical and mental health. And then, as I've mentioned a few times here, adaptation and building resilience to climate change is a cyclical process. So you may not perfectly get it right in the first cycle. You may reject retreat in the first cycle, but it may come up again in future cycles. And because this plays out over fairly long time periods, start the process early so that you're not trying to play catch up as climate change impacts are happening. The second half of our process good practices, be creative in retreat solutions. And again, there's no one size fits all approach to retreat. Some of this may involve physically moving buildings. Some of this may involve demolishing buildings and facilitating people to move to new locations. And some of this may play out over decades of gradual retreat as opposed to a single type of retreat. In a COVID-19 pandemic environment, I think it's very critical to consider overlapping disasters as a risk. What are the challenges of trying to implement planned retreat or climate change adaptation when other disasters are unfolding at the same time? So do a little bit of contingency planning as you plan your climate change adaptation cycle. Using an all hazards approach, communities often have a single clear hazard, but multiple other hazards that may happen or may affect that community. So as you're starting the adaptation process, it's often useful to understand your vulnerability to multiple different hazards, not to just focus on the obvious hazard. On the right-hand side, you can have climate change, the best plans laid for climate change adaptation and planned retreat, but those can often be delayed significantly by local and provincial or even federal elections, where activity seems to stop and basically wait for the election cycle. The last good practice on this slide on the bottom right side, get professional assistance, and this connects back to the encouragement to tap into consultants. If you don't personally feel you have the expertise in your institution, then tap into consultants, researchers, research institutes, and get some assistance with this process. Okay, it looks like we've left a good amount of time for discussion, so I'm going to turn it over to our hosts and see how this plays out. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Brent.
That was me to present the team's results.
And you covered a lot of ground on a very challenging topic that I think every one of us has a lot of questions for. And also a big thank you to Michael for addressing some of those questions and digging into some of those more specific areas. So I thought since Michael handled a lot of the heavy lifting here, I thought I pulled up some themes that maybe we could discuss. One of the earlier questions dealt with why did you choose retreat versus migration, and maybe just talk a bit more about how you would choose language for a specific community.
Well,
so Michael, did you want to handle that, or would you prefer
read? But
I
think that the nuance of your thoughts on the language of retreat are also of value as well.
Sure. Okay. So sometimes I think with the terminology, you're more or less locked into or pushed towards the terms that are most common in the literature. And so managed retreat was the most common. Retreat is a bit of a touch point for some people. They feel it's akin to giving up in the face of a challenge, and this is more important in some communities than others. Migration, I think that might be softer than the word retreat. It offends fewer people, or it gets their backs up less. But I think also the word migration can also trigger thoughts of a series of steps rather than one move. Again, I think the counsel here is that no one phrase or word is going to be acceptable everywhere. So work with the community that you're in, and whatever phrase they're comfortable with. I personally would encourage, well, we would encourage everyone to use that approach.
And I saw in a presentation last week they had a quote from a World War II general that said, retreat's just advancing in a new direction. So it's really how you frame it. And we had a lot of questions about kind of natural infrastructure and how they relate to retreat. And I've heard in the past that retreat is a natural infrastructure practice in some respects. So maybe you could just elaborate more on the interface between those two approaches.
Sure, and I think that comes into the idea of creating community benefits for areas where retreat has happened. So if I'm interpreting the question properly, following retreat, there's an opportunity to create green infrastructure or recreate what was there before, a naturalized landscape, which might have some recreation amenity. But I think the co-benefits of retreat, looking at green infrastructure or just naturalized landscapes, are very significant. And we see this in coastal areas, we see this in river areas, where there's an opportunity to create additional flood capacity or flood water storage capacity by retreating and naturalizing land. So
we did have another question about the importance of health and social well-being through retreat, and I think Michael answered it in the thread there, but maybe we can highlight verbally how that's included in the report.
So maybe I'll call on Patrick to answer that one. I wasn't able to monitor the chat, so I don't know what's
Yeah,
been
and sorry, John, could you
said
just
before.
repeat the question there for me? I missed the specific reference.
I believe it was a question just highlighting the importance of health implications and social implications in retreat, and maybe you can just highlight how that's included in the report.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. And this was a particular area of interest that had its own sort of dedicated section, and we got some nice feedback from the advisory team on that as well. The way we had sought to break up the health discussion was along sort of immediate or short-term individual health impacts, long-term health impacts, and then long-term community impacts as well, which in themselves would sort of trickle down to the individual. So I think what Michael had mentioned in the chat was some of the short-term or immediate health impacts. Often, retreat is happening to individuals that have already experienced pretty severe stress and maybe dealing with economic hardship as well. So we're quite concerned about mental health impacts as well as the consequences of displacement. As we get into long-term considerations, we start to look more broadly at some of the other social determinants of health. And something that repeatedly popped up was the importance of really targeted and comprehensive thinking about the areas being relocated to. I know in some of our case studies, we were dealing with elderly populations being affected, and there was discussion of them being relocated away from a lot of fairly essential community services. And then last but not least, as we started to consider community impacts, we got to this element of cohesion and what to do with retreated lands. In some cases, we would see really not much is being done with retreated lands, so they fall into further disrepair, and that can have quite negative consequences. But there's this opportunity to be proactive and add benefit from doing something productive with the lands being retreated from. And that can in itself be an opportunity to promote and protect community well-being further. So I'll pause there, but happy to expand on that further.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm going to try, or sorry, go ahead, Brett.
Maybe I can just add to that and put a slightly more positive spin on the health implications. And this is possibly more directed at long-term climate change adaptation involving retreat, where communities might begin to see the positive health benefits of the retreat lands if they're returned to a naturalized state or if there's a significant recreational component. So I'm thinking of a coastal area fronting ocean front, which previously had been private property, where the wider community is not allowed access on that private property. So post-retreat, that becomes community property and actually feeds into positive physical health for the wider community.
I'm going to try to roll a couple questions together here. Sort of the difficulty that people find with retreat, either through communities not being adverse to it or not wanting to participate, or areas with high value communities, or other people brought up that areas have historical and social and cultural significance, and how would a community work through those tough situations where retreat doesn't look like an option that can go ahead.
Right. I would say that like any of the climate change adaptation options, no one option works in all communities. And so I think what we're promoting here is a suite of options, and one of those is the retreat option. So if you think about a wealthy community, oceanfront, and they highly value that ocean view, maybe thinking of some of the communities around Surrey, British Columbia, what happens under sea level rise and projected storm surges? What happens to those coastal properties? So if you take an integrated perspective, you might talk to community members and you might say, well, we can protect those properties if we put a 2-meter dike in front of your waterfront property. And that might not be acceptable. So I think working with a more integrated para approach can reveal to people who are maybe now resistant to the idea of retreat that some of the other options aren't as good as well. So there's an opportunity to think through the implications of each of those options. If I accommodate my $10 million waterfront home, does that mean it's now up on stilts and it looks strange in the neighborhood? Maybe retreat isn't so bad. So, I think we're promoting an integrated approach where there's multiple different options that are on the table and working with communities to help them decide which of those options are best for them. Maybe where it gets a little thornier is where each of those options has an economic cost attached to them. So, that 2-meter dike in front of the waterfront property, if it's 3 or 4 kilometers long, might cost the wider community $200 million. And is that the right approach? Where retreat
maybe
could
switching
be cheaper?
to a positive focus, what are some of the good co-benefits of retreat that you might not get with other para options?
Yeah, so I think those co-benefits, broadly speaking, maybe 3 of them come to mind. So the first one is the naturalization of formerly built up areas, and that has all sorts of ecological benefits, ecosystem health benefits, and even in some cases for cities, it adds to their park stock. So ecological and environmental benefits. The second benefit, I think, really comes back to the psychology of the people who are agreeing to retreat or being asked to retreat. And if they can clearly see the co-benefits being laid out in front of them, that helps make their decision. And maybe the third area is what type of, I hesitate to use the word infrastructure, what kinds of amenities do you envision for that retreated area? Is it purely naturalized, or will you have walking trails? Will you have community gardens that people will also value? And in at least one of the case studies, a really critical part of the post-retreat discussion was we need to commemorate the people who used to live here and have decided to retreat for the greater good of the community. So there's a bit of almost a spiritual element, I guess, of commemoration, or an emotional element. So yeah, maybe those 3 areas would come to mind.
We had a specific question about the Gatineau case study. They were provided $200,000 to relocate. Did citizens view that as an ethical and appropriate amount for them to move, or did they struggle with the relocation?
I would say it really comes down to the value of the house, of the people who are considering a retreat. And some houses in the Point Gatineau community, especially the older and smaller homes, that might be adequate to allow people to move to something similar in another location. But in other parts of Gatineau, there are homes that are worth $700,000 or $800,000. And so that amount of capped compensation is nowhere near what they personally needed to consider relocating to an equivalent property. So those are very challenging discussions. Should there be a cap on planned retreat compensation, or should it just be based on pre-disaster home values? Some communities have chosen to give compensation based on post-disaster values. So that's a discussion, I think, that's very specific to post-disaster retreat. And there's probably a different discussion about pre-disaster or just generally climate change adaptation. So if we're trying to anticipate 30 years down the road climate change that will trigger coastal flooding, how much compensation should we provide to help people move out of these hazardous zones? And is that based on current tax assessment value? I think ideally, more compensation money available is better than less. It gives you more options, and it probably provides more a wider latitude for people to accept those offers. But every program has limitations in
And we were looking at Canadian case studies today. How did we compare with other international examples?
In some cases, I think United States is probably the best example. They have very specific legal and regulatory frameworks and also institutions. And so the Canadian cases in some areas were not very comparable to the United States. But I think what we found that's fairly consistent across multiple different countries, Australia, New Zealand, US, Canada, is that the idea of planned retreat is gaining traction. It's becoming more acceptable. And I think this is based on disasters that are really opening people's eyes. It creates an opportunity for change.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to see if the team had any final comments that maybe didn't come up in the questions that they wanted to highlight as a key area or a key point.
No, nothing for me. This is Patrick. I did just want to thank all of the participants for their great questions in the chat, as well as Michael for taking lead on those, but some really excellent questions, and we appreciated the participation.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think we'll always have to have a presenter bring some support to answer those questions. So that was very effective, and I think people appreciated that. So I will point out that today's webinar was recorded, and it will be posted on the link at the bottom of the slide that's on your screen now. You can also visit the Adaptation Canada webpage to learn more about different adaptation approaches or options. A big thank you to everyone who participated today. This is an exciting topic with a lot of interest, and a big thank you as well to the presenters who took the time to work on this report and engage broadly and present today. And we look forward to coming back in the fall and having a launch of the report so people can use it and read it themselves. Any other final thoughts from the team?
I hope a lot of the questions that we weren't able to get to today are answered when the report comes out. So maybe we can engage Climate Risk Institute in helping promote that report when it comes out.
No, I think that's...
I'm just putting that out there. I didn't confirm this ahead of time.
There'll be a lot of interest, and we'll have a lot of work ahead of us to promote the report and share it broadly. So thanks everyone again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, everyone.